translation. You're creating a new work inspired by, informed by the old work, but it's not the same thing.
Not the same thing.
Yeah.
I think also the idea of text as body, the textual body of just the image you showed of the patchwork, of the story space, colored story space boxes.
Yeah.
You remember we used to sit and play with the colors and try to make them work, right? And the palette was so limited, but it was fun to think that we had color to work with in 1995. And then we can move those boxes around and shift the space between them. So you really are stitching together a patchwork quilt on the screen.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, so the project, just a little bit about your project Genesis. Can you tell for historical record, what gave you the idea of doing this particular work? Why Patchwork Girl? Why 1995? Why Story Space?
Well, I was at Brown. I was in the graduate program at Brown, and I'd heard a lot of talk about hypertext in the program and even before the program, because I think Robert Coover had written about it in the New York Times Book Review already before I even went there. And I didn't have a particularly strong techie bent myself, so I didn't know that I would be interested, but I was interested in experimental literature and nonlinearity in particular. So I was attracted, kind of, and when I got there and heard people talking about it, I wanted to know more, and I took a class because that semester it was all that was available, rather than taking, I think Coover taught a hypertext class. I didn't take that because I couldn't that semester. I took a class that was like a theory class with George Landau, and he asked us to do a hypertext project as, I think, our final paper, and that was when it was for that I did the earliest version of Patchwork Girl, and that sprang out of some doodles I'd been doing in my notebook while listening to him in class of a scarred female monster, kind of a female patchwork girl already.
What year was that?
That
and the books came out
maybe 94 or
so
93, 93 or 94. I don't know for sure. And I should say also that I'd been fascinated with Frankenstein for years already. I took a class with Avital Ronell. I audited a class with Avital Ronell years before when she was teaching. In fact, I've never acknowledged my debt to her, so let this be my acknowledgement. When she was teaching at UC Berkeley, and I went to her privately and said, "Can I just sit in your class? I can't afford to audit it," and she let me. And she taught Frankenstein, and it was so interesting I think then I was pretty young, and I think I had not much learned how you could read older literature through a super contemporary theoretical lens, and how much could be found in it that was latent there. And although she didn't talk about it from the same standpoint as I've done here, it always remained in the back of my mind that there was a lot going on under the surface of that book, and in particular the sort of chopped off narrative thread of the female monster that was created and then canceled out. The creation was canceled out. Struck me as like one of the great unexplored narrative possibilities in literature. So I don't think it had occurred to me that I could write about that. I could, pick up that thread and extend it, but when I was called on to write theoretically about hypertext in Landau's class, it struck me that the connections I was seeing between hypertext forms, sort of elastically linked body parts, and so a kind of monstrosity that I associated with the feminine, could be best addressed through this central figure of a female Frankenstein monster who was strong and strengthened even by her monstrosity and multiplicity, but not totally sanguine about it either, conflicted as one would be, made up of disparate parts. So
the great monsters of mythology are female. Sure, just Scylla, Medusa,
Grendel's mom.
I mean, the great monsters. They're misshapen female bodies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I thought I always connected this work with that kind of continued mythos about the female body.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's a lot of, I think I was inspired by Donna Haraway too, I would say.
Yeah.
You know, that famous essay, the way it turns
I read
a kind of
cyborg
epithet
goddess.
into a, you know, battle slogan practically, like, yeah, I'm monstrous.
Yeah.
Fuck you.
I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess, is the last line that
Yeah.
say. Yeah.
I think that was also in the back of my mind there.
Had you read Ronell's telephone book when you took her class? That's a brilliant book about.
I could never read the whole thing. I had it. I owned it.
Yeah.
I had fingered it.
Yeah.
So what I originally wrote was, for Landau, was more kind of meta hypertext. It was more about hypertext and, to some extent, I guess, about identity and the feminine and textuality and materiality of texts and bodies, mapping them onto each other. So it was kind of the gnarl of theoretical concerns that informed my project. But then, I guess Coover probably showed Landau maybe. Anyway, someone showed it, what I'd been working on, to Mark Bernstein, and he wanted to publish it. And I said, well, okay, maybe, I guess. Hadn't thought of it quite that way, but not now, because if I'm going to publish it, I want it to be something more than it is. Didn't feel like I'd fully explored its possibilities. Mm-hmm. And then I added a lot more sections. So the initial core was developing this central image of the monster and exploring the theoretical concerns. But I added later the quilt section, the graveyard, quite a lot of the story, because I felt like it needed to be fleshed out. And in particular, in the graveyard and the quilt sections, I really wanted to somehow more literally embody the fragmentation and the multiplicity that I was speaking about in more general terms in the other sections. So like the way that the quilt section is actually made up of borrowed quotes was really important to me, and was something I had only done. I'd gestured toward that without actually doing it in the other sections, except in the sense that I was, of course, borrowing from Mary Shelley. And then in the graveyard too, I wanted the reader to feel that there were distinctly different human stories, kind of, that were about completely other concerns than the Patchwork Girl's own concerns, of which she was made up, so that you could really have a feeling of what it might be like to be made up of other people whose stories were really their own, not yours. So they really did kind of pull in different directions.
So you were using story space for this, but you were studying under George Landau, who was creating Intermedia, right? He had Intermedia, that was his hypertext authoring system. There were so many at the time, right? They were kind of coming out of nowhere because we didn't have a browser back then. So you had to be able to author hypertext in a standalone environment. So there were HyperCard, Story Space, Intermedia, so many different versions. Why did you choose Story Space? Is that the only one you had access to, or was it something about the way it's
it was
constructed?
I think it was almost happenstance. I was given access to it, I think, in Landau's class. I never even played around with any of the other authoring systems. But I also found myself pretty attracted to it. I really liked the physicality of moving the little boxes around and seeing the links connecting them and being able to sort of physically drop them into another corral and so on.